This is Conspirinormal.
You don't want to show people that insane tack board behind me that has Mothman pictures and UFO and Lee Harvey Oswald.
With the string.
It's actually a real thing. There's no string, though.
Is there a connection between Lee Harvey Oswald and the Mothman?
Yeah.
We want to know.
I could make one if you want there to be one.
Okay.
The people on my board, this is actually really funny. The people on my board are actually sectioned into things like smokers and non-smokers, and like who I think would probably be the most left-leaning and who would be the right-leaning. Like I have them separated up into their peer social groups.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
These are historical figures, or these are current figures?
Well, mostly historical figures and people who are like paranormally minded. So I have like Richard Shaver is right next to John Keel and Jim Mosley.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But let's see. I'm trying to look at this board here. But like Robert Stack is down by the bottom by John F. Kennedy.
The strange connection between Kennedy and Robert Stack.
They rolled in that weird Hollywood. That was a whole Hollywood circle.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. I guess what was the Peter Lawford? I guess probably would have been the connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because wasn't he married to like JFK's sister or something like that?
Yeah, or they were dating or engaged or something. You guys know as well as anyone, relationships with the Kennedys didn't go very well.
No, that's very true. That's very true. Well, John, we're going to talk about the book, but I always enjoy talking to you. So, I mean, we if we stray from the book, I mean, that's totally fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
I mean, honestly, whatever topic you want to talk about. I mean, yeah. Yeah,
we both got the book too and read it, so it's
so
really
you're
good.
You're part of the experiment.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about that. Is that something that you want to?
Sure.
Like, why is this thing an experiment?
To a certain degree. I mean, I can't tell you exactly what it is, but we can discuss the concept of it.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, guys, welcome back to Conspirinormal. And we're just going to jump right in because we already have. And we have John Tenney on the line, one of our favorite guests. John, I think this might be like the 5th or 6th time I've had you on. I'm not even certain at this point.
And this is, I think, there was a huge gap between the last time I was on and the time before that. I think there was like a 2-year gap.
Yeah, it was something like that because
and this is shorter now. This is only like 7 months.
Yeah, it's something that long. I think it was like back in November we had you on when we talked to you and Aaron Gullius and Richard Haddam. I think you had all three of you guys on for a roundtable episode.
But that was a really good one.
That was.
Yeah, I'll definitely tell people to go back and check it out if you haven't heard it.
Well, you had set us up with Craig Ciccone.
Oh, yeah.
Craig just I had him on for a couple, like 2 or 3 episodes, and I need to get him back on because it's been a while since I've had him on now. You know what?
Craig would probably be a great guest for you guys right now because, Craig has spent the past, I don't even know, 8 or 10 years writing a comprehensive book about Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party.
Yeah, we did talk to him a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think that would be a really interesting, topical, and insightful interview for right now.
Yeah, it's been so long that we could probably just go ahead and just do a whole interview just on that.
Yeah.
Honestly, because that was an episode that we did in 2014, I want to say, and we talked about most of the assassinations of the 60s, and then Fred Hampton was in 69. So it's funny, John, because a lot of people, because of everything that's going on right now, some people are actually just now finding out about that. Like I have a good friend of mine, and she posted about it. And she's like, I had no idea. And I was like, I've known about this forever. Like this is
I mean, that's the failings of our institutional system, or our educational systems, right?
Yeah.
Like, how many kids are not taught? I mean, I grew up in middle class white America, and I didn't know about Fred Hampton. And I live on the outskirts of Detroit and grew up with African American friends my whole life. And I didn't know about Fred Hampton until I was 16 or 17 years old, had never heard the name, didn't know anything about the Black Panther movement. Like, it was just completely cut out because it wasn't discussed in school.
Yeah. Yeah. Nobody knew about just like that he was basically assassinated. I mean,
along with almost all of the Panther leadership assassinated.
Yes.
First time I heard about it was in the middle 2000s, back when I was going deep into like the conspiracy rabbit hole. And really back then, and we're going to talk about some of this later, but like the conspiracy oriented stuff was really anti-Bush and anti-establishment, and people were just like uncovering and some of the stuff that had happened from the 60s.
Oh yeah. Well, Fred Hampton's FBI file is still sealed. He's one of the people that, Craig has had an open FOIA request for like 20 years to get those documents, and they're still sealed.
Wow. And he's still not been able to get anything from that.
Nope.
Yeah. So he still is like actively working on that book?
I think he is, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I found out about it because that was when I was 16 or 17 is when I met Craig. And Craig introduced me to Paul Lee, who is a Malcolm X scholar. And so that's where those conversations were generated from. So I was lucky that I fell into that group of people. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have known about it either.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a lot of stuff about Malcolm X, too, that was weird.
Well, yeah, and the other thing for me too is weird because there's a whole Malcolm X might have talked to an extraterrestrial thing. Do you guys know about that?
Really? Now we know about Farrakhan. We know all about that stuff.
Right, but no, Malcolm X talked about being visited in prison by the spirit of Allah, or what he thought was a spirit. And so, people have said, like, is that an occult thing? Was someone remote viewing to him? Was someone astral projecting to him? Was it an extraterrestrial? So there's a whole ball of wax there to melt down.
Greg Bishop recently had this guy, Stephen Finley, on, who's an academic who, what he's been talking about is this idea of the Nation of Islam as a UFO religion.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard it too. And, that's the whole thing, is it goes back to the concepts that you guys are well aware of, and I'm sure your listeners are too, of like, we're just calling things names due to our frames of reference. So, if you look at even books, whether you are okay with the research done, but, the books written by like Hilary Evans about like combining the ideas of apparitions, ghosts, spirit sightings, Fatima, UFOs, like it's all seems to be similar experiences that we're just all giving a different name based on our perspective.
Right. Yeah. And in the United States, race being something that separates people so much, so much of these narratives that have similarities are so unknown to each other.
Right. Well, I mean, the fact that when Albert Bender first saw the Men in Black, they were African American men. He described them and drew them as being black men.
I've never heard that part. That's interesting.
Yeah. You look at the pictures that he drew black men. And he saw them after doing a magical ritual.
Right. Because he was like
they're
big.
In suits,
he was huge. Yeah, he was huge into the occult. And a lot of people don't know that the origin of the Men in Black come from an occultist, essentially.
So since they're in suits, they could be like the Fruit of Islam, the security part of the Nation of Islam,
or they could be Loa, who are depicted in suits with hats on.
I just remember there was a headline from the Onion one time that said,
we got deep really fast, didn't we?
Yeah,
no doubt. I remember there was a headline from the Onion at one time that said, "Fruit of Islam makes man soil fruit of the looms."
Right.
All right, so John, you have a book out.
Yeah, kind of.
And kind of, and it's called Theoretical Weirdo. So, what does that title mean? And also, we understand that this is kind of part of an experiment.
Yeah, so I had been looking at things that I had been writing and saying in my lectures for years, and I'm a much better speaker, presenter, and lecturer than I am an author. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to give people short bursts of things that I've written over the years and said over the years, little like chapters of 2 or 3 pages, just things that blast through my mind. And I'm going to give them stuff that I've written from 10 years ago and 12 years ago, so that hopefully you can see even a progression in my thoughts about the things that I'm writing about and thinking about. And hopefully that'll allow people to move into deeper areas of thought and construct better ideas. But the name Theoretical Weirdo came because I kept reading people in the paranormal, supernatural, and even skeptical community who kept posting quotes from theoretical physicists. And I thought, like, what does that term mean? Like, so are you a physicist that just thinks about things? Like, that's your job. You think about physics. You theorize about physics. And I think about weird stuff. So I must be a theoretical weirdo. Like, that's my specialty, is weirdos and weird stuff. And I think about theories about them. So I'm a theoretical weirdo. And so I just threw that title on there. I actually had problems getting that book published because my picture is upside down and on the front cover. And
yeah, that kind of messed with me a little bit when I took it out of the box.
That's good. That's good. But yeah, even the publisher didn't want to print it that way because they were like, this is going to look confusing when it's on like book stands and stuff. And I said, no, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want to happen. Just shift your mind for a second even. But the other thing, so yes, it is part of an experiment. So also, we live in a world right now where anybody can publish a book. You can go online, you can upload anything and have it printed on demand tonight. You know, basically it takes 48 hours or 72 hours or whatever. But we live in this world where information is easily and quickly accessible. You have corporations like, you know, major publishers, whether it be Penguin Books or Random House. You have major publishers that are multi-million-dollar publishers that are going up against people who are just in their basements. And I really made this concerted effort to put out a book that sounded the way that I do lectures, and even had the mistakes that I make when I do lectures in it. And this drove my copy editor crazy because I kept telling him, like, no, you have to leave that run-on sentence. No, that word needs to be misspelled. No, this comma is supposed to be improperly used. That sentence.
I was wondering about all that, man.
And I did that on purpose because we do live in this world where things seem very sanitized, and even you know, a person will write a blog post and then they'll get called out on a misspelled word, and then they'll go back and respell it. And in the future, all of this stuff is going to look like it was perfect. And that's really bothersome to me for some reason. It just sticks in my head because we are imperfect people and we make mistakes, and we need to see those mistakes. And so that's part of why I put the book out the way I did.
So you did purposeful mistakes?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. There are words. I'm trying to think right off the bat. I had 2 people copy edit it, and we literally driving them crazy when I would say, no, I know that I repeated that word there. Leave those repeats. Or they would come.
There was one that important had like 8 M's in it.
And in that instance, at the end of the page, I tell you that I've misspelled it on purpose.
Yes.
So that the book is also an experiment. So if you have it, then you notice that it says like volume 1 or book 1 at the top. So there's a second Theoretical Weirdo that comes out next year. And the whole first chapter is kind of dedicated to the experiment of this first book and the responses that I've gotten from putting out this book. And that's, I can't really describe the experiment or what the experiment's doing, but I've already seen some results from it, and it's super interesting. And it does have to do to a certain degree with some things I've already talked about. So there's hidden stuff in here already.
Okay. Yeah. It was very interesting, and as I was reading it, I was like, is he meaning to misspell these words? Are these actual mistakes? You know, because it intrigued me when I saw you post something on Twitter about it, and you said that this was an experiment. So I think I knew after the important with 8 M's, I was like, I think something more is going on here.
What's really funny is not only did my 2 copy editors go crazy when they were reading it, but I have other friends who are copy editors that weren't involved in the book who have the copy, and they don't know that I was doing it on purpose. And they were like, holy shit, what are you doing? And I was like, no, you talk to Dave. He already copy edited it. And they're like, why did he leave that in? I'm like, because I told him to leave it in. And their minds were just blowing that someone would write something and put it out being flawed. And again, that's concerning to me.
Right.
Like, we should be able to accept mistakes. We should even be able to accept people's ideas if they contain simple mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's when you're dealing with, especially now, like you just said, when you have people can just like put their books out, and they can just when we're in the self-publishing world now, whether it's Kindle or electronic copy or physical copy, either one, anytime that I read any of those books, I'm always finding some kind of mistake. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who it is.
The concept actually came to me because I collect copies of 1984 the way that other conspiracy theorists collect Catcher in the Rye, right? So I have
interesting.
I have 30 or 40 copies of 1984, and the idea of putting out a book with purposeful mistakes in it came from the fact that I was reading a copy of 1984 that came out in the late 90s, and I was about halfway through the book, and there was a "the," but it said "there" instead. Someone at the publishing house. I mean, and it's 1984. It's from a major publisher, and it was "there" instead of "the."
Right.
And I was amazed at how much that pulled me out of the book.
Huh.
And then I thought to myself, this is super interesting. I've become accustomed to everything being perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this book that I love and collect, and all of a sudden, this one word, 130 pages in, pulled me out that significantly. What does that say about my mental state and how I consider ideas? And if someone speaks improperly, do I have a tendency to listen to them less?
Yeah. That's a good point, John. As I was reading this book or any other book that has not purposeful mistakes, but just mistakes, I will read something like that, and 9 times out of 10, really, I just kind of just replace the word that it's supposed to be and move on. I think myself as doing this, and I've had to read a lot of self-published material doing this show. Mm-hmm. You get to the point where it's like a lot of it does have these mistakes in it, and you just move on. Right. And I guess that I've kind of trained myself in the last now over 8 years that I've done this, that it's just a matter of course. It just is what it is.
I think that that's really incredible. I think that's awesome for you to be able to do that, because I don't think that a lot of people can. And I don't think a lot of educated people can. I think that a lot of so-called educated people get to a misspelled word or a weirdly placed comma, and then the whole book and all the ideas contained within it are garbage.
Throw it across the room, throw it in the fire, and it never. Yeah.
Well, on the other side of that, I'm kind of having some difficulties in my own research, because while it's great that especially occult topics are actually being explored so much in academia now, there's things that I'm trying to get access to that as an independent researcher is just such a pain in the ass to get academic books, get access to them. And then of course you're not going to be able to buy them because they're hundreds of dollars. And that's that kind of academic writing that abstracts things and, takes it further away from normal people also.
Yeah. I recently, I'm in a pretty decent situation because my sister she's a professor at the University of Michigan. And so she can do interlibrary loans between colleges. But most people can't do that. Like some people, like there's, a certain book that I wanted and it's only available at the University of Indiana. And if you don't have access to the University of Indiana, that book is inaccessible to you.
Well, one of the things that we've noticed, John, is that there's obviously there's an academic world and there's a popular world. And so we had a guest on that covered up the name of a certain person in their more popular book, right? But in their academic book, it was very clear who this person was. So, but the thing is that no one, like the layman, isn't going to have the money to afford this $350 textbook.
Right.
It's just assumed that there's no way, they're going to find out, even though it's well published.
Well, and this goes back also with academia and higher learning, as we recognize it. The fact that, when I sometimes will talk about science as being kind of, and I'm not the only one, obviously, we all kind of talk about it in this manner, but like with science, high sciences being a new kind of priest caste system, because if, I don't have access to, I don't think anybody really has the money to be able to afford all of the science journals that our whole world is being based on. Mm-hmm. We're reading news snippets that are based on an abstract from an article where if you don't have, the Journal of American Medical Association, which is, whatever, $500 a month, you're never going to read the actual report and the science behind it. You're going to have to read some person's 3-paragraph description of the 1-paragraph abstract.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And that leads right back to priests being the only one that can read the Bible.
Yeah, not to mention the language and jargon issues and everything else.
Yeah. So I think that was another thing with Theoretical Weirdo that I wanted to do too, was I wanted to take, so I have some really silly things in there. Like there's a chapter called like, do ghosts wear underpants? And it's a really silly chapter, but what I hope that those things do is because I'm trying to make things accessible to people, which is if you see a ghost wearing clothes, like where did its clothes come from? Yeah. Very commonly people see Civil War soldiers or military men in full dress uniform. Like there's a complication and a uniqueness to military uniforms. Like who stamped and pressed the buttons that are on a Civil War ghost's jacket? Who put together the fringe along the sleeves of a Civil War man's jacket? Who sewed the leather belt together that he's wearing? Does the ghost have to think of all those things to make them? Do they have to be in your head for you to be able to see them? It sounds like a silly question, do ghosts wear underpants? But the underlying question is where I really want people to explore the idea.
Yeah, it's like, do we make these things? Do we kind of conjure these things up ourselves, or do we just or is something else conjuring what we expect to see?
Right.
Yeah, I think in that chapter you're talking about whatever these things are. Perhaps they're influencing our minds, and that would probably be easier than influencing the electromagnetic or physical world.
Yeah, the idea that they are using kind of default imagery that we have in our heads, because if I have obviously I've seen Civil War movies, so I have an image of a Civil War soldier in my head somewhere. And so all they have to do is spark that image, and then I have that visualization without the need to manifest a full body and clothing out in the atmosphere. It's a lot less energy use. But the thing is if they trip an image of a Civil War soldier in your head, you say that you're seeing a Civil War soldier. I say I'm seeing a Civil War soldier. We don't know we're seeing different images. So we just assume we're seeing the same one.
Yeah, because we have this generic idea of what a Civil War soldier is going to look like.
Exactly. And the most commonly seen ghosts are these like I said, default settings where people will say, like, I saw a very wispy woman in white, or I saw a shadow figure. Like, this is where you don't have, or the ghost or the entity or the spirit or creature or whatever, it can't find a visualization for itself in your head, so it trips a default, which is a silhouette of a man, the silhouette of a woman, a white woman in a gown. And as we create, this is the thing I find fascinating, as we create crazier and crazier monster movies and comic books, we have more and more vivid representations and images in our heads, and we see a more and more crazy creatures in the world.
Yeah. Like it has to use that raw material, and especially people so mediated as us now. I mean, that's just that raw material is just really rich.
Sure. And this is where you get into the idea of artists having some involvement in the phenomenon and what's going on, because if some weird creature entity wants to make itself known and wants to be seen, jump into the imagination of a comic book artist or a filmmaker, and they draw it down, they sketch it out, they put it on the big screen, millions of people see it, and now you can jump into the world.
That's kind of similar to the egregore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or come through in a heavy metal riff.
Yeah.
So you've got a little chapter in here about that I thought was pretty funny, and actually a couple of chapters about demonologists or self-proclaimed demonologists, and you kind of do this little thought process or little thought game where you talk about, like, it's probably a demonologist is not what you want to be called.
Yeah. So words are super important to me. You wouldn't know that because there's so many mistakes in Theoretical Weirdo, but that's part of what's going on with the book. But words are super important to me. And so when years ago, as an example, when the show Ghost Hunters first came on the air, which I think was in 2003 or 2004, I knew that ghost, the etymology of ghost comes from Geist, which means wind or breath, and I understood that. And hunting doesn't necessarily mean killing; it means to, kind of walking quietly through the woods in pursuit. And so I was fine with that. But like, I went backwards and looked at the first time anybody had ever used the word ghost hunter, right? And so it mostly shows up in common usage around 1904. There was an article by H. Addington Bruce called The Ghost Hunters, and it was about paranormal researchers. And so I was like, oh, okay, so that's kind of the provenance for this name. Well, when I got, the first books by Ed and Lorraine Warren as a teenager, and the word demonologist kept coming up over and over again, I tracked it backwards, and I realized that the first real common usage of the word demonologist were witch killers. It's what the Catholic Church called men who sought out people that were supposed to be cavorting with the devil and doing witchcraft, and they killed them. And those people were demonologists. And for hundreds of years, demonologist was a person who killed a person, an innocent person. And so now you have this, kind of rebranding of demonologist. It's etymologically correct, the study of demons, but it has a 300-year history of being associated with the worst closed-minded people in the entire world. And so I think in the book I say, like, even if you call yourself a demonologist, I'm not going to do that because it's a terrible thing to call yourself.
You're like witch finder general.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and people saying, I always try and make things a little bit, because people say, like, oh, but it had a meaning in the past, but that meaning doesn't mean anything now. But it does. Like, words are important. So, when does that meaning when does that meaning go away? When does the 300-year history of the word demonologist go away? Did it go away in the 70s because somebody wrote a book and rebranded it, and so now we're not going to use 300 years of our own history? In essence, that's saying, like, if you look at the state of the world going on right now, and someone says, like, oh, I like publicly funded roads and publicly funded schools, which are national social programs, there's a reason why you don't call yourself a Nazi.
Yeah, but
right? Because
that makes sense.
Etymologically, it's correct, but it has a history to it, and it's attached to a certain group of people. So you don't use that word.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a trigger. I would have to say,
right?
For sure.
Faux pas.
And so when I hear people saying, "I'm a demonologist," I'm like, you are literally calling yourself the name of people who killed tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, we don't really know the number, of innocent women because they lived at the edge of town and owned property, because they were outspoken, because they didn't want to pay their taxes, like literally just murdered women.
Well, in the next chapter, you mentioned something that I really do want to pick your brain about, because and you mentioned the Warrens before. And talking about like how there's literally in some paranormal investigators, demons are like literally everywhere.
Yes.
Okay. It's become a trend. And I really think that this really kind of starts with the Warrens, that they are kind of the beginning of that. And it really comes from a very, like it's not even mainstream Catholicism. It's like a traditionalist Catholicism. I know you said you met Malachi Martin, and he was very much in that. The pre-Vatican II, anything after Vatican II, they didn't recognize,
right,
this kind of stuff. And when you watch like the Conjuring movies and the whole Conjuring universe, I always feel like since at least like maybe the second Conjuring movie, I feel like I've just been getting like this real kind of like traditionalist Catholic propaganda being force fed into me every time I watch those movies.
Yeah,
that's how I feel. And so it just comes from a certain belief system. This whole idea that everything is literally demons, like a good friend Timothy Renner says, everything is demons. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? And like the Warrens themselves, I mean, there's some
heavy problems there.
The more I look at them, the like I used to think their stuff was pretty solid, but now the more I look at them, it starts kind of crumbling down.
Well, I think there's still a lot to be undone by the Warrens. One of the things that I will say is I think people of my age and perhaps just a slightly bit younger, maybe people into their 30s, we all kind of grew up reading the Warrens books because they were popular and they were out there. And so we thought that's kind of what paranormal stuff was about. And as you get older, you come to realize, the Warrens were an outgrowth of the Satanic Panic movement of the 70s. You had evangelical America just going crazy with, Satan is everywhere and music is going to send you to hell, and there's backward masking in Led Zeppelin, and they practice magic, and it's demons and Aleister Crowley, and the Warrens are very much of that era, and they were very scared of the things that they didn't understand. And so, if there was a Native American burial ground, that person was going to kill you. I mean, a lot of the stuff that they write is fairly racist, and it's very narrow-minded through the spectrum of heavily religious, especially, European Catholic belief systems, and that becomes problematic if you don't realize that that's what's happening. There's other aspects too, which I don't think that people really understand. So I have no proof of this whatsoever, but I'll just put it out there because it rolls around in my brain forever. And if I'm wrong, someone can tell me, and I'm fine with being wrong. But there's a Twilight Zone episode that almost everyone has seen, which is called Talking Tina, right? And
the doll
that talks, right? And Telly Savalas is in it, and he can't get rid of her, and then finally the doll trips him and he dies. And whatever.
Yeah, that's a classic. Yeah,
that's a classic.
Yeah.
The year that came out is the year that Lorraine Warren discovers Annabelle. And Annabelle is the mother's name in that episode of The Twilight Zone.
Uh-huh.
So,
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So that has always been like, oh, she's telling a Twilight Zone story.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, just simple things like that. And I mean, that I don't even know how long I've known that, and it just never gets talked about. But again, you see, the portrayals in popular media with the Conjuring films and stuff, and it just gets further and further away from even what the Warrens wrote. And the Warrens' history is very weird, and there's a lot of strange stuff going on in the background, and they themselves had a very weird life. Talked to a couple of people about, there's an idea in the paranormal community among certain people that the Warrens started researching haunted houses so that Ed could sell his paintings of houses. A lot of people don't know Ed was a painter, and he used to paint the houses along the shoreline on the East Coast, and there was no way to sell them, and so he would paint a house, and then his wife would go up to the house and tell them their house was haunted, and so she felt the need to tell her husband to paint it because it's a haunted house, and then the person wants to buy the painting, and then you sell the painting, but then the person thinks their house is haunted.
Weird. That's a racket right there. Okay, well, my impression of the Warrens, kind of what I've come down to, is that I think Lorraine had a very true believer streak in her, that she believed a lot of this stuff that she was doing. Yes. I think Ed, on the other hand, I think he was much more pragmatic, and he was really into it for the money or for the fame or for whatever kind of grift that he could get. He was just much more practical, essentially. Yes. And he kind of supported her belief that there was stuff really going on. And there's a couple of things that, like I enjoyed the first Conjuring movie. The second one, I just couldn't get past the fact that they were even involved with Enfield.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And apparently what it really was that
Ed was sent home from there.
Yeah. It was like
he showed up and they sent him away.
Yeah, like Guy Lyon Playfair told him to leave.
Right.
As I understand it, and I guess Maurice Green was the other guy, and those were the two guys that wrote the book. And Guy Lyon Playfair, as I understand it, the book is very detailed. It's not sensationalist at all. A lot of people that have read it have said that it's boring, but that says a lot for it, that it's not, it's a werewolf, Yeah. But there was other things too, like one of the biggest cases for me, and I've met John Zaffis a couple of times. I had him on the show a long time ago, and
I've known John for a long time.
And I believe that John believes that there was stuff going on. He had he maintains that he had an experience in that house, the one that was the funeral home in Connecticut.
Yep.
But there's the reports that the guy that ghost wrote that book for the haunting in Connecticut, that Ed told that he couldn't get a story straight from Carmen Reed and the family.
Right.
They all had different stories. And Ed actually, he said that Ed actually told him the family's crazy. Just do your best.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that comes up a lot of times in personal notes and in conversations, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that Lorraine probably, to a very large degree, was psychic at one time or throughout her life, and had a very deep belief in all of this stuff. I don't think that Ed was as into it as her, but I do think that it was, I know that it was colored by their religion. And that should give us all pause whenever we read stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you this, John, too, about hoaxing in and of itself in a situation. If someone is hoaxing something, then that can almost kind of springboard activity, because it was said in Enfield Poltergeist case that the girls have admitted that they hoaxed certain things, but they did it in order to kind of prime the pump.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any difficulty. I have difficulty with people hoaxing stuff for sure.
Right.
But I also recognize that if it's done in I think that hoaxing, like anything in our lives, and I'm just thinking out loud right now, so you're going to get it however it comes out. I think that hoaxing, like anything else, can be a ritual.
Absolutely.
And I think that when it's done with ill intent, I think that when it's done to make somebody money or they're just trying to fool you, I think that that's the hoaxing I get mad at, because it falls flat and it doesn't generate anything worthy. I think that when Gray Barker would make strange telephone calls to John Keel because he thought it was funny and he knew that it would drive Keel crazy, I think that eventually Keel started getting weird phone calls that weren't from Gray Barker.
Yeah. Right.
And I think that there is a difference. I do think that hoaxing and tricking people and doing something strange can spark a phenomenon because it opens up people's minds to an experience. But, you know, there's obviously a different type of trickery that goes on for a television show or a movie or documentary or whatever like that. That's something that I just couldn't stand.
Well, it makes me wonder in a case like Haunting in Connecticut, just to take that case, for example, and John, I mean, I tend to believe him that he had an experience in that house.
I do too.
Is there a possibility that, okay, you know, that there is a certain amount of, that there is a mass hysteria element to this, but everybody having so much fear, because, you know, you hear the story that they all had to sleep in one room. They were so afraid, all this kind of stuff. And then that collected energy kind of just does manifest something horrible and horrific, because that's what it, like we talked about the Civil War soldier, that's what it thinks we want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I did an episode of episode of a show called Kindred Spirits with Amy Bruni and Adam Berry. Right. And we were at this place that's called Belvoir Winery. Sorry about that. In Missouri. And there was something in this old building. And I don't know what it was. There was a weird energy, and I knew it because I had been there a few times. But it had gotten weirder and darker. And I never really thought that there was anything bad in this place. All of the times that I had been there before, it didn't seem bad, but then all of a sudden these reports were coming in that something was bad there. Well, they called me in because they couldn't figure it out either. And I think it's actually really good television because at one point I say to them, this thing that's in here is just being what we want it to be. Mm-hmm. So all of these groups that kept hearing there were bad things in there kept going into this place and saying, why are you bad? Why are you evil? How come you're mad? How come you push? How come you scratch? And as this thing listened to all those voices, it thought, I must be evil. I must be bad. I must be scratching. I must be pushing. And that's how it acted. And so I started talking about, on that episode, egregores, and how we feed into building something in a location. And what was really crazy when we were actually filming, I was inside the building with Adam, and we were talking about Amy, and we did an EVP session, and the voice on our recorder was Amy's voice. And when I heard that, I took Adam and I went outside and I brought Amy in and we started talking about Adam, and it switched to Adam's voice. So it really was giving us, like, moment to moment, the things that we were thinking about and talking about, because it didn't know what it was. It had been created and it was just trying to fulfill a need. This became problematic when Chip Coffey came in, who's a Catholic, and immediately started talking about demons. And then the whole place went like batshit bonkers. And I was like, you got to get out of this place because I don't want to deal with something that thinks it's a demon right now. But I think it's the first time on any television show where we've actually discussed egregores on like a Travel Channel show.
Yeah, that is an interesting and hard concept to get your mind around. We had Mark Stavish on about, I don't know, a year and a half ago. And that was probably one of the most interesting books that I've ever read. But just I really had to have him explain what it was. And it's like a tulpa, but on steroids.
Right.
And that seems very familiar to me, like what you're talking about, like the Philip experiment. That's a very, that's like the classic case. Sure, where they created this character and they gave it a certain amount of personality, and then all of a sudden people started to get communications from Philip.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the majority of haunted houses are haunted by us. I mean, you walk past an old house in your neighborhood and you think it's scary, but you're not the only kid doing it. Every kid has done it for 20 years, and eventually that house becomes haunted.
I actually, somewhat off topic, but I did enjoy the chapter where you talked about being in a particularly haunted house. I believe it was, oh man. But you were in a house and like weird things started happening, and it turned out to be, the way that you write it, you think that it's a horrible ghost, but it turns out to be something completely different.
Oh, the Demon of Judgment.
The Demon of Judgment, yes.
Yeah, because we have difficulty, at least I do. I have difficulty sometimes being at a restaurant or a bar and discerning the motivations of a human being that's sitting across from me. Someone that I can look at, hear, see their body posture, hear the inflection, tonality, and timbre of their voice, and I still don't really know what their motivations are. And yet ghost hunters walk into locations to deal with ethereal spirits that they can't really hear, they can't really see, they can't touch at all. And they immediately know and discern everything that spirit is trying to do. It just seems so ridiculous to me. Especially placing concepts like good and bad on it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You and I, we're all fine right now with where we're at, because if you wanted to, you could hang up and leave right now. But if you were trapped in a place that you couldn't leave for 10 years or 50 or 100 years, you might become frustrated. You might become lonely and sad. You might finally gather up enough energy to manifest a hand and reach out to touch someone. And because you don't have a hand anymore, just the manifestation of a hand, you might snag their hair or accidentally scratch them. And then that person turns around and goes, something in here just attacked me.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't know the motivation.
Right.
Yeah, you don't know that. That's a very good point. But also too, like, when these investigators go in and do these things, like they automatically assume what they're dealing with is a deceased person.
Right.
When it could be a myriad of things. I mean, we could be dealing, like I've said many times before on the show, we could be dealing with time. We could be dealing with some kind of time phenomenon that we don't really understand.
Right. Right. Well, I hear ghost hunters all the time will say things like, treat ghosts the way that you would treat a human. And I understand that idea. I understand that concept. But the reality is they're not. They might well have been human at one time, what we consider human now. But whatever they are, if they're there, they're not human anymore. They can walk through walls. They're invisible. They might be able to speak manipulating energy in a completely different way, seeing in a completely different way because they don't have biological bodies. And so to treat them as a human is fine because you can show a certain amount of respect. But at the same time, we tend to treat other humans pretty badly.
Yes. Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Well, it just makes me think how much of occultism since the 19th century really came out of spiritualism first. And if, really occultism centers around changing consciousness and manifesting things with your mind through ritual, that, I guess, is the original playground for doing these things. If it is something like what you're talking about, whereas it has a lot more to do with our influence on the environment.
Yeah, I actually talk about it in the book because I have some old new lessons for paranormal researchers in the book. But one of the things that I do, if I have to do a group session in a haunted place for a convention or a conference or something like that, usually everybody's walking around with their EMF meters and all of their buzzing gadgets and trying to talk to a ghost. And what I do is I do this thing that's called the circle method, which is very kind of spiritualist, seance-y, which is I make everyone sit down quietly, put all their equipment away. Everyone holds hands. And then let's say there's 6 people there. I'll be the start and I'll ask a question, something like, can you tell me what you see? And then the person next to me, I'll squeeze their hand, and that person next to me asks the exact same question. And then they squeeze the hand next to the person, and all 6 people ask the same question. And the reason that a lot of times it works very well is because our minds aren't cluttered thinking about what we want to ask. Everyone is waiting to ask that question that they've just heard 4 times. They're waiting to say it. Everyone, and then you get a response, and it's an answer to a question. Imagine that. We collectively used our minds to press into that other world. You know, if you're doing a normal EVP session, you got 9 people in a room, everybody's thinking of what question they're going to ask. It must be a cacophony of questions on the other side.
So in searching for something external, people can find their own power.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, you know, I think I talk about it in the book, which is if ghosts and spirits or entities, if they're not manifesting outside of us in the environment, and I think that some probably do, but if they're not, if there are some that are using our brains and our minds and our consciousness to contact with us, I find that much more intimate, much more personal, and it connects me much, in a much deeper manner to the unknown world, because I'm an active part of their communication with me. I'm not just an observer to them and they are somewhere else. They're they become part of me in that moment.
And these aren't this phenomenon isn't regulated to having to die.
Right.
It's a big explosion of energy that I could see how it could create manifestations, but we all experience really intangible things with other living people, with things that people who are still alive have left places, and you know it's not regulated to just things that have died.
I've told people for decades, and I'm sure there's psychologists out there that will explain it better to me and explain to me how the process works. But I really don't think that you need to get into physics and quantum mechanics to explain a lot of this stuff. Some of this stuff is just weird, and it just works weirdly. And one of the things that I've always talked about is I can't tell you how many times throughout my life I've opened the door to a bar or a restaurant or someone's house. And the moment I've opened it up, I've thought, this place sucks for no good reason.
Yep. Yes, that's happened to me before.
And it's not
bad energy.
Yeah, it's not even an internalized dialogue. It's not even how I talk to myself in my head. I just know it. I know this place is bad. I've walked up to people at conventions, or they've walked toward me, and I've thought, uh-oh, this is going to be a problem. And for no reason. And I think that's we exist and we interact with a much larger world than the senses.
Yes, absolutely we do. Absolutely we do. There's a couple of things that you talk about in here about in the book about some of the paranormal research, and these kind of go together. And so a section on 5 myths of paranormal research, what those are, and then kind of the 5 reasons paranormal research is not taken seriously.
Yes. You want to go through them, and I'll just give you a play-by-play? Do you have the book in front of you?
Yeah, I've got them. I've got it right here.
Let's go through them.
Page 34, 5 myths.
Yeah, due to television movies.
Yeah. So 5 myths that people think about paranormal investigation due to movies and television. All right, what's number one?
Demons are everywhere.
Yeah, we've covered that.
We've covered that one.
People think that they are everywhere, and they really, for as much, again, I don't know what a demon is. I don't know what a ghost is. So for there to be demons all over the place, I mean, that's what's problematic too, is these, in the paranormal community, we should be not making declarative, definitive statements. I know that people hate that, but we are a speculative and theoretical community. And for people to say that is a demon, that is a ghost, that is an apparition, making that is this, that leads you down a very long and dark path. And I'll tell you though, working for television, they love demons, and
yes, they do.
They cannot get enough of them. They want them at every twist and turn, and they will pigeonhole them in any way they can.
What kind of advertisers are interested in demons, do you think?
Demons get a lot. It draws viewers in. People like horror movies. And so they like watching what seems to be a horror movie on television. I can tell you, as a guy who's done this 30 years and has done not only paranormal conventions, but done horror movie conventions. I sat next to, this is a absolutely true funny story. I sat next to Eileen Dietz, who played Pazuzu in the original Exorcist film at a horror movie convention. Wow. And so I've seen an actual exorcism, right? So her and I were talking all weekend about real exorcisms and The Exorcist and her playing Pazuzu and what demons might be. And we were having these very deep, genuine, silly conversation. And people would come up and they would get photos of her face as Pazuzu signed by her and their Exorcist posters and stuff like that. And throughout the weekend, she noticed that like nobody was really talking to me. And so she started on Saturday going, this guy, and pointing at me, she goes, this guy next to me is a real ghost hunter and actually has seen an exorcism. You should talk to him about it. And people were actually scared and didn't want to talk to me about it. They like it when it's fake. They like it when it's portrayed as a horror movie. But when you start to actually want to have a conversation about things like this, it makes people very nervous.
Well, maybe that fictionalization helps them deal with what might be the reality, or helps them process it. It comforts them.
For sure.
So the next one is EVP is a relatively new process.
Yeah,
and I want to point out on all these lists that you count down instead of up. I just want to point that out. I think that was meant too.
Everything has a purpose.
No doubt.
So yeah, you would think, and it's because of the popularization of ghost hunting shows and reality shows, where everybody thinks that, you started doing EVP sessions, probably people started doing it in the 90s. And that's just not true. Ghostly voices people have attempted to record ghost voices as long as it's been able to be recorded. Even to the, we call it electronic voice phenomena only because we're using electronic instruments. But people tried to do it on wax cylinders, and people were doing it back in the 30s and 40s with machines that actually etched records and the original reel-to-reel tapes. And so this idea that it's only something that's been going on for 25 years or 30 years is just a mistake. It's been going on for almost a century now. And it has developed and changed, but it draws even more questions to it, because if you are trying to capture a ghost voice on an analog recorder and you're trying to capture a ghost voice on a digital recorder, and you capture a ghost voice on both of those things at the same time, you've just captured two different phenomena, because an analog recorder and a digital recorder record in very different ways. And right. So, you've just captured a voice that can transfer itself onto ferromagnetic tape, and you've just recorded a voice that can somehow change air pressure, because that's how digital recorders record sound.
Okay, so 3, probably my favorite one. Screaming at a ghost is a great way to get a response.
This again is from televisions and movies. People think that they need to be loud. They need to scream into the void to get these entities to hear them. As if the ghost that is standing in front of you is far away from you because it exists in a different dimension. So you need to be loud and you need to be assertive. I think later on,
and wear as many tap out t-shirts as possible.
And wear as many tap out t-shirts as possible.
Axe body spray doesn't hurt either.
You know, if anything, when we were talking about, creating a haunted house, if a ghost or an entity or a spirit, whatever you want to call it, if it can be left behind because of a human-born energy, then the possibility exists for that human-born energy to leave parts of it behind while you're still alive. So if you go into a room, if you have a ghost hunting team that goes into a room on Sunday at an institution or a prison, and they're kicking the walls and punching the walls and screaming at the ghost to come and talk to them, and then you go in there on Monday, and it seems like someone in that room wants to fight you, it might not be the ghost, it might be the people who were there yesterday.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. And then when you have a whole bunch of people just going in there and just doing the same thing because they watched a particular television show.
Well, and I even talk about in the book, there's a whole nother chapter, but I talk about the fact, and this kind of relates to screaming at ghosts, which is the most common form of spirit communication worldwide, historically, cross-culturally, is prayer. And prayer is silent. You speak in your mind, knowing that your thoughts are being divined by the spirit world. And so to think that a ghost can only answer your question when you mouth the words, I think is a meandering path.
Yes. So number 2, psychics, mediums are needed to investigate.
Yeah, that came up with television. It's funny because one of the very first kind of paranormal reality shows is the ghost episode of In Search Of with Hans Holzer. And Holzer brings a psychic with him, and they do an EVP session. It looks exactly like an episode of Ghost Hunters from 25 years later. But yeah, this idea that you need to have a psychic walking around the house to give you information, that's just not needed to do paranormal investigation. As a matter of fact, I've often made the case that if I have a psychic, before I can bring the psychic into the location, I have to investigate the psychic because I'm investigating paranormal phenomenon. What they're doing is paranormal. So I have to investigate the psychic first before the psychic can investigate the location.
Yeah, you got to know if they're legit, if they are actually legit or not.
Yeah, and I've met I won't burn the number too high, but in 30 some odd years of doing this, I've probably met 1,000 people who have said that they were psychic, probably over that, but I'm going to shoot low and say 1,000. And I will tell you, in all honesty, again, I don't have any secrets. Out of that 1,000, I've probably met 6 people who can do something repeatably and on cue.
Right, and as you do have a whole chapter in here about like how easy it is to fake any of that stuff.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of it is just like goes back to just like mesmerism and all that. Well, all that kind of practice.
Even when I started out doing all this stuff, and I've talked about this in different interviews, but when I really wanted to understand how I could be fooled, one of the first things I did was I became a magician. Like, I joined the International Brotherhood of Magicians and the Society for American Magicians, and I started practicing magic, and I started attending lectures and conferences of magicians and mentalists because I wanted to know how I could be tricked. And it's been an invaluable resource to know how I can be tricked.
Right, exactly. A lot of people don't understand that. One of my favorite presentations at any conference was, are you familiar with Aaron Houdini?
I am.
Are you familiar? So he did a whole thing of just like how, as a magician, having that knowledge is like key, because then you can get away with a whole bunch of stuff, and really a lot of it is just distraction.
Well,
just distracting people's attention.
And again, so I don't have any secrets. So this is why I'm a terrible magician, right? So I was at a conference once, this is 10 years ago, with Aaron. He was there and he was going to be doing a magic act. And I was standing outside smoking and he said, "Hey, Tenney," he's like, "You're a magician, aren't you?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "You belong to the societies and stuff." And I'm like, "Yep." And he's like, "Okay, me too." He goes, "What kind of cigarettes do you smoke?" And I go, "Winston Lights." And he goes, "Will you be my gaff in the crowd?" And I was like, "Sure." So we went across the street. We bought a pack of cigarettes. He took it up. He did his setup. We had a crowd full of people. We threw the beanball around until I got it. I stood up. I was picked randomly out of the crowd. And somehow or another, he had a pack of my cigarettes hidden under a box, to the amazement of everyone. And it was as simple as just saying, "You're going to be the guy."
Right.
Sounds like wrestling.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the final one.
Ooh, magicians will be mad at me for doing that on this.
Giving it away. Investigation happens at night.
Yeah. I think the going response that people on TV now say is that it's quieter. So it's better to hear the subtle sounds of a location. That's why they investigate at night. That's kind of if you ask people who are working on television shows, they'll tell you there's less distraction. The neighbor's dog isn't barking. There's not as many cars driving around. There's not a lot of airplanes flying overhead. And that's all very practical and understandable. The problem is that there's also not a lot of sound and it's dark. And in the situation when you don't have a lot of sound frame of reference and you don't have a lot of light for visual references, your brain starts to manifest imagery and sounds. And so it becomes problematic to investigate at night. I love investigating during the day. Pennhurst Asylum, that I've investigated a number of times, is only active to me every time I've investigated there during the day. And I've always chalked that up because at night, everyone that was ever at Pennhurst was told to keep quiet. And so when I walk in there and start saying at 3 o'clock in the morning, talk to me, if there's a spirit that holds a memory of Pennhurst, they knew that if they talked, they were going to be punished. But if you go there at noon and you walk around in the cafeteria, you get amazing EVPs and experiences because that's when it was active and that's when people were allowed to communicate.
Yeah, so it makes more sense. It's just that we have this kind of like tradition, I guess, television and film that we think is like, oh, the haunting time is at night. And 3 a.m., the adverse.
The anti-Jesus hour.
Right, the anti-Jesus hour, yes. You know where I was going there.
Well, and then there's just the whole idea of people being more open. Because the night does change our psyche. So it might make people more receptive, but as far as actually, doing something in an objective, investigative way, that's not probably the environment that you want.
Well, I think you're absolutely right because that's a much deeper point, and I think you're absolutely right. I think that, so for me, when I started researching and I kept hearing about like 3 a.m. and 3:15 and these are the kind of witching hours and demon hours and ghost hours, and this is when spirits haunt, and it was coming up all across different folklore and different stories. And the first thing I really was interested in is what is my brain doing then? And so if you can, any of your listeners, you can look up, like if you look up the circadian rhythm of the brain, about 2:30 is when the melatonin in your brain drops for the day. Mm-hmm. And it starts to put you into a heavy REM sleep. Well, if you're awake, that melatonin drop still happens. And so your mind is expanded starting around 2:30 and it peaks around 4 o'clock. So between 2:30 and 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock being a major hour, if you go to sleep at 9 or 10 o'clock, most people wake up out of a nightmare at 3 o'clock because that's when the melatonin is really starting to hit. And so if you're awake in that experience, you might be experiencing a much wider reality than you would experience during the day. What's problematic is that on TV, almost no one is investigating at 3 o'clock. They usually contractually only investigate until midnight or 1 o'clock, and then they just change the time code down at the bottom of the screen to say 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, no.
Oh, wow. You're giving away all the secrets tonight.
My illusions are ruined. You mean I can't believe they would do something like that.
when I did Ghost Stalkers back in 2014, we had massive arguments with the network because I told them Chad and I, we were going to investigate from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. And we had massive arguments about us actually investigating for 12 hours because they had never had anyone investigate for that long at night. And it was a big concern to them. What are we going to do with all that footage? We don't need all that footage. We don't need you to do that. You only really have to be there until 1 or 2. And I argued and won, for better or for worse. And it was fine, but I wasn't going to lie. I wasn't going to just have them change that time code at the bottom.
That show was so refreshing, though, too.
But,
because I was so bored with the regular kind of show, and the way you guys did that was just like, it was simple, but it was...
it could have been, obviously, whatever. It could have been so much better. There was stuff that was cut out because the network just didn't understand it. To give you as an example, we were driving to a location where people were seeing a weird apparition, and I was talking about why it seemed to be that there were certain places where communication was easy in regards to talking to the other world or another world. And right as we were having that conversation, which was being filmed, we drove past this giant military radar installation. And I stopped and got out and looked it up on the computer. And it was this place in Georgia, I think, which is a giant land-based SETI telescope.
Wow.
Right. And I was like, holy crap, this is a mile away from this place where people easily communicate with spirits, and we have a giant satellite that's trying to talk to aliens like a mile away. And we had this great conversation about extraterrestrial intelligences and ghosts, and of course it all hits the cutting room floor because the network's like, why are you talking about aliens?
This is a ghost show.
It's a ghost show. You talk to ghosts.
It was just, well, the way that you guys did it, it was just you guys with just one of you would go in and you would have like just a camera.
That was a big problem
yourself.
too.
Yeah, I'm sure that it was, but it made it just much more real than just like, oh, you're a couple of guys go in and they're like, they're supposed to be the only ones in there, but you got a cameraman and a sound guy and probably a couple other people, so yeah. it was just so much different than that. My
biggest cut that got out of that show that made me the maddest was someone in one of the locations had seen an image that looked like a goat man, and Chad was like, a goat man? Like, what the hell is a goat man? And so later when they were editing the episode together, they sent me an email and they said, could you send us a voiceover kind of explaining the mythology of goat men throughout history? And so I wrote like a paragraph, and it was fairly comprehensive, mythology of goat men and Muhammad, Bahamut, like all that thing, and I just went down that road. And it was so funny because the paragraph kind of ended with, but in modern society, the goat man has been relegated to the demon. And when the episode came out, that entire paragraph was gone, and it's a single sentence that they cut together out of that paragraph, and it's me saying, traditionally, the goat man is thought of as a demon.
Oh, gosh.
And everything else was gone.
Oh, man.
That made me slightly upset.
Yeah, it's just they're always editing for time and all this kind. You did, though, at one point there was a discussion. I do remember a discussion about a goat man or something, and you said that, well, this could manifest itself in anything that it wants to be manifest or something like that. You said,
yes.
And I was watching that and I was like, yes, somebody finally gets to say that on television.
Yeah, we made little breakthroughs here and there. Ghost Stalkers, I think, is still the only show. The very last episode, the 6th episode, Chad and I have a 3-minute conversation about the Society for Psychical Research. And we actually show the logo on screen, and we show William James and Edmund Gurney, and I think Henry. I think we show the Sedgwicks And I think we're the only show that has still ever talked about the Society for Psychical Research.
I think this is a good place to talk about this, but Hellier, I mean, you're very much involved with this. I mean, we had Greg on, we've talked to Alan Greenfield several times now.
Uh-huh.
And I haven't had the chance to talk to you about it. Like I said before, the last time we had you on, I hadn't even watched it, but I did get a chance to watch the whole series. I absolutely loved it. Do you think that that's going to change some things in the paranormal media? Do you think it's going to get some more recognition than it already has?
I don't know. It's hard. So I think what's interesting for me is, so like my introduction to Hellier is literally shown on camera, which is in the first season, I was at home watching television, smoking cigarettes, and I got a phone call at around 3:30 in the morning, and they wanted to talk to me about synchronicity and goblins and weird stuff. And that phone call is in the first season. And that was when I found out what they were doing. I had no idea what was going on. And, I told them, well, it's in Hellier itself, but I told them that you can go down as many roads as you want to, but those roads lead to diverse and sometimes very dark places. And if you look at the researchers of the past, you can see those dark places. John Keel, a lot of people don't realize, was, died pretty much broke and, in a fairly hoarding situation. Gray Barker dies broke and lonely and sad, being known as a hoaxer and a trickster, and nothing he can say can be trusted. And, Morris K. Jessup allegedly commits suicide, goes to Florida and kills himself. Like this community has had its share of people who have tried to follow the threads. And if you want to follow them, they will lead you places, but you will not control. You can go to an edge and you can fall over it very quickly. And so that was my concern when I heard them talking and the way they were talking. The conversation that you see in Hellier, the first season, is only a few minutes long, but we probably talked for an hour and a half. And then I told them, if you're going to continue down this road, I've been to that edge before. I've been almost completely insane and had to pull myself back a few times. So if you need me, I will be here for you because you're my friends. But this is not my case and not my investigation. Like, you have to do what you think you need to do. And in the second season of Hellier, I was talking to Connor, because Connor, I think, was in a weird place working with the numbers. And I had talked to him 3 or 4 times, just direct messaging through Twitter. And he called me and said, "Can I talk to you about the numbers?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, we're on our way to Detroit." And we rented a hotel room and filmed what you see in the second season of Hellier.
Yeah, that's the very last scene, I think, right at the end of the last episode. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Where I talked to them about, I think that what they are doing is a very old process, but I think they're doing it in a new way. And I think that trying to do it in an old way is not what it wants. I think I actually say in Hellier, it wants new magic.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Hellier has succeeded in doing to a certain extent.
It's become very much like a ritual in and of itself.
Yes.
I mean, I can say that, like, after, I watched it and I kept telling Seraphiel, I'm like, this is like, a lot of this is everything that we had been talking about, like stuff like Rebirth of Pan and digging into the occult kind of Thelema stuff that we've been talking about too. Synchronicity as well. All that was everything that we've been talking about, and like my own life kind of was taking a weird synchronistic turn in 2019. Mm-hmm. So it was like a cap of when I watched it, like, okay, this is just too weird. So I think for a lot of people, they really feel that it's almost like a magical ritual in and of itself.
Well, I think, yes. And I think that the phenomena, or whatever you want to call it, the experience of reality that we seem to be having, I think it finds a myriad of ways to express itself, and we don't readily know them quickly. So, like, what's a good example? I think the most downloaded song in the past, like, 10 years is a Spanish dance song. And it's all about falling in love and losing your love. But what's interesting to me is there's an entire portion of the song that says, like, I want you to write your name on the walls in the cave, and I want to get lost in your maze. And when I realized what that song was talking about, it was talking about an initiatory process. And this came out, years before Hellier, and I was like, has this thing been trying to manifest? Like, is it trying to find a way out? Is it trying to get people to think about it in more ways than just magic? And so I even went back and I looked into the past. How would it have manifested before? If you look at the rise of, magic systems and ritual magic back in the turn of the century, what was happening back then? And all of a sudden you run into all these books about Pan. You run into Arthur Mawken's The Great God Pan, and you run into these stories of Chambers as the Yellow King, and you have these stories about this giant magical creature that if you see it, you'll go insane, and it gets you lost in mazes upon mazes, and this initiatory process. And I was like, holy shit, like it seems to pop up in every field: literature, music, dance, film, and it tries to express itself in different ways. The most watched film on Netflix is Bird Box, which is about a creature that if you see it, you go insane, which is the story that Arthur Machen told in The Great God Pan.
Wow. Interesting that you mentioned the Yellow King, because the last episode we talked about that. that came up in there, so there's another synchronicity.
There's a little sync for you.
Yeah.
I have been for whenever I get bored, I go back to the Yellow King and try and figure it out.
That's one I'm gonna have to read because it does come up a lot.
I think there's something there, and when I read it, my brain understands it, and I think that there's something in there that I can find. I know that that's part of its legend and lore, but I'm one of those people.
So I will turn to more like contemporary kind of political stuff. I know that there's been a lot of turmoil lately, and it's kind of started to kind of hit the paranormal community,
yes,
as well. And I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this, John, because I know you've been pretty active on Twitter and calling some people out. And, I have noticed that there's a real, I hesitate to say right wing, but more, I guess, conservative leaning in the paranormal field. I kind of wonder why, I guess.
I mean,
Zerfield's got some insight on this too, but
I mean, there's the paranormal community to a great extent is very European biased, and it carries along with it all of the horribleness that brings. I mean, whether it be the writers and the occultists of the eras in the 1900s that carried along some pretty racist viewpoints, whether it be the idea that only white Europeans could be the dominant magicians, and everybody else was doing horrible, savage magic that didn't really need anything. It needed to be broke down and stylized and ritualized and made into something palatable to actually work. That carries over into the paranormal community. It carries over into the UFO community. I mean, Ancient Aliens is about as racist you can get. Saying that because white Europeans can't build the pyramids now, there's absolutely no way that Egyptians could have 2,000 years ago unless they had help from aliens is a pretty racist comment. And that just shows you, I mean, it's embedded in people. And I think very often, I hear people say, well, why aren't there more black ufologists or black paranormalists. And the reality is part of me growing up as a white middle class kid is that I had the free time to read books and not worry about stuff.
I think that's part of it, but
the other thing is there's a huge religious community behind it as well. There's a lot of people who seek the paranormal because they are uncomfortable with the prospects of life and death, and they find comfort in it, and I understand that. But to find comfort in it, usually you have to have a very heavy religious belief system. And if you have a heavy religious belief system, you've probably carried along with it some of the horribleness that carries along with it, especially if it's Judeo-Christian. The thinking that you're right, the thinking that you have a right to something, that is very problematic as well. I'm most upset because I guess I grew up trying to always be better and think more clearly and think more openly and more accepting. And I have watched over the past few months people in this community and who do not want to think more openly. They don't want to have better ideas. They don't want to construct larger ideas. They want to continue to think that ghosts are ghosts. They want to continue to think that fairies are elves and fairies are fairies and elves, that aliens are aliens, and they want to disregard. I had a tweet today that said, it's amazing to me how many paranormalists are afraid to stand up and say something like Black Lives Matter, but they have absolutely no fear in approaching a stranger in their house and saying you have a demon in your house or a ghost was murdered in your attic. To say these incredibly, what sounds seemingly insane phrases to someone's face that you've never met before with no evidential proof that it's actually real. But when it comes to a real topic, all of a sudden now you're afraid to speak out.
Yeah. I think like it's weird because I feel like in some ways, and I've gotten a little more, I think, on the political side or talking about more like the kind of conspiracy stuff or more talking about some of the historical stuff on this show and not being afraid to tackle some of that. But there was a big thing around about 2017. There was a kind of like this shift for a lot of paranormal podcasts, it seemed to me, at least for my own, where it was like we got so exhausted by everything that was going on politically that we didn't really want to talk about it anymore. So there's this idea that like these paranormal podcasts are like an escape for a lot of people from what is going on outside or outside of the paranormal world. And that's fine. But I think at a certain point, does it become, where you just can't say, okay, we can't avoid this. We can't truly avoid this anymore.
Right.
Like what's the fine line between providing that escapism of ghosts and aliens and all this kind of weird stuff that we talk about but at the same time facing like what is happening. I mean, we're in some really socially tumultuous times right now, probably getting to the point where it's going to be even worse than the 60s as far as that's concerned. And so it's like, do we, it's like is not facing it and just providing an escape the right way, or is trying to find some kind of middle ground?
Well, I mean, escapism is fine. Obviously, people need a way to get away, whether it be meditation or listening to music or podcasts or stories or movies or whatever. But when does escapism become blinding your eye to injustice or to inequality? You can get tired of looking at people being beaten on the streets. But then what does it say about you if you see someone being beaten on the street and you just turn around and you don't help and you don't say anything and you don't do anything? Like, even saying and I'm aware of my own iniquities and the work I have to do on myself, but that's fine. Like, we have to try and construct larger narratives and, like I said, better ideas, and we do that together about talking about these issues sometimes, and they're, of course, they're uncomfortable. One of the, just as an example, saying like we're headed toward a time that will be worse than the 60s. You just said that a second ago, and it kind of hit me, and I thought to myself, yeah, for white men, like, it's always been bad for black men since the 60s. That's
an incredibly good point.
Right?
That's an incredibly good point, because I always, one of the things that I go back to is, we talk about, a lot of people talk about Waco, and you had that whole thing, but nobody realizes what happened with MOVE in the 80s in Philadelphia.
Right.
Yeah. Like nobody cares about that, and we've said that many times. I've said that on the show. I mean, I've said that, like, a lot of this conspiracy-minded people now don't really understand. A lot of them are just like, when it happens to white people, that's when they notice. But if it happens to somebody else, another group, another color, whatever, another race, they don't notice. They don't seem to notice as much.
Right.
And so it's just, that's something that we've talked about a lot.
And the thing that's interesting to me, because I've done this for so long, and the thing that I think is frustrating to me when it comes to conspiracy theories to me, and still to a certain degree conspiracy theories were mental gymnastics. It was a way for me to hone and sharpen my critical thinking skills, because this crazy story would come out about an underground base and aliens fighting, and it gave me an opportunity to stretch not only my imagination but my intellect and start figuring out what was real and what wasn't. And unfortunately, what happened was conspiracy theories became, you're not supposed to think about this. This is the crazy thing that's happening, and now it's real. Stop thinking about it. Just know that these people are eating babies. That's a real thing that's happening right now. They're eating babies, human babies right now. And before, it was, when I started, it was a way to say, like, okay, but how wouldn't that be real? Like, what would happen to a human being who actually ingested 8 pounds of blood, right? Like, you wouldn't be able to keep it down. You can't eat 8 pounds of human blood. You'd immediately start throwing up and get sick. Like, that's not a real thing. So, like, that doesn't make sense. And then, but they're actually aliens, and so you could use it as a way to hone your psychology to find out what was real and what wasn't. And all of a sudden, conspiracy theories became, no, this is real. There's no need to think beyond it. It's real. There's no gymnastics needed. Here it is. It's laid out. Read the numbers on the bottom of the Twitter feed. They match up to the calendar date that's in this movie. That match up to what Bob Dole said in 1987. That match up to what Trump just tweeted. And trust us, that's real. And that's the thing that blows my mind the most, is that conspiracy theories were always about, don't trust anyone.
Yeah. Well, it got weaponized, and I think Ken Thomas did a real good job of showing how the Trump's rise to power was all about weaponizing these conspiracy theories. The main thing I think has happened is just that people interested in alternative information, people who were into alternative information in the past, it was a reaction against more conservative establishments. We would read about CIA coups and stuff like that. But I think as a lot of the right wing has really gained ground in presenting themselves as the alternative to the establishment, that this is how people are getting politicized.
Yes.
And they're mostly people who weren't very political before.
Well, and
this is them being politicized through this stuff.
And I'll tell you what, at a very base psychological level, conspiracy theorists who were left-leaning, saying that, talking about the right in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the conspiracy theorists of then, did not seem very powerful. They were hippies, They were pot smokers and acid heads. And there's a portion of America who looks at what they now consider the conspiracy people, and they all have rifles. They're all ex-military. They're very strong. They can protect you. And that, to a lot of people, is very comforting.
Mm.
Mm.
It's very frightening to me, actually.
Yeah, well, same here. I mean, we've talked a lot about. We've done a couple of shows just recently about kind of the digging into the way that the right wing has kind of organized itself looking at historical information.
Right. Yeah.
And that to me is like, I think really like, I really wanted to ask you about this because like you have your foot in both kind of those worlds. Like you're very well known in the paranormal world, but what a lot of people don't seem to know about you is that you're very well versed in all this kind of, that old time kind of conspiracy stuff from the 60s and 70s.
The Conspirinormal stuff.
Right. Yeah. Yep. We started talking about Fred Hampton, like at the very beginning of our conversation. A lot of people don't know about that. A lot of people are finding out about it, and like they don't like the way that I see is like I just see more of like how. Well, I'll just go ahead and say it. I think the right wing is just more out of control ever than the left. And, like it's the way that a lot of the ways that, okay, if there's like a George Soros that's like doing everything, then you got to look at the right wing too and how that has been manipulated by the rich, by their elite. People like the Koch brothers and even people that are much more insidious that are behind it. If you reference the show that we did with Recluse, I mean, the research is out there. It's just nobody's paying attention to it because it's not sensational enough.
Well, and the other thing is the hardest, I've said this before, probably on your show, and I've said it on Twitter a couple times, but the biggest conspiracy that no one talks about because it's too hard to wrap your mind around is that no one's in control.
Yes, yeah. That's the one that I. That's the one that I subscribe
everybody
to.
is vying for power, and but no one has any control over any of this stuff.
Yeah, if you want to get a good handle on what's going on, you got to look at what the competing factions, that have always existed are doing. It's not one. People get blinded. They're either like one or the other. There's a lot of cabals and evil groups of people all around the whole world.
Right. And the thing that's crazy to me, just on topic, is I recently saw. When I say recently, it was like 3 years ago. I think it was when Trump first got elected. I saw someone post a picture of Trump was destroying one of Obama's FEMA camps where Obama was going to put all of the conservatives, and I was like, oh, wow, that's really weird. And I dug through my archives and I found the photo of Obama's FEMA camp when it was George Bush's FEMA camp.
Yeah, of course.
And I had found George Bush's FEMA camp because it was originally Bill Clinton's FEMA camp. And I was like, this photo's been in circulation for 25 years. Like, it's crazy.
How long have we heard they're going to cancel the election?
Yeah.
I've started to hear that from some, much more left-leaning people that I know about this year.
Yeah.
The election is going to get canceled. But I was hearing that stuff come out of Alex Jones's mouth in 2008, talking about Bush.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And the thing is, I think that's the problem. I think that people won't even look into the past, because we are inundated with so much information. Like, it's surprising to people when they find out about someone like Fred Hampton, or they find out that a city in, Pennsylvania was bombed. Like, the fact that people don't want to look 5 years in the past, much less 25 or 50, and see that history does repeat itself, and that these factions have been warring for power, and that there is really no ultimate control over it. I mean, if anything, it's just millionaires trading money back and forth between themselves. But there's no point in putting anybody in a camp anymore because you need labor. You just got to keep people at a barely minimum living wage thinking that they kind of like their life and they'll go to work every single day. And that's the thing that frightens me the most. The people always say, when I'll end, I'm going to have to wrap this up with you guys, but I'll end with 1984 since I kind of started with 1984. the part of 1984 that makes me cringe and worry the most isn't peace is strength or war is strength and peace is freedom. None of that. That doesn't worry me. It doesn't even worry me the last sentence of the book, which is, Big Brother had finally won. He loved Big Brother. That doesn't bother me. The part that bothers me is when Orwell describes the proles. When he describes the people who still go to work, they watch their football games, they scratch their lottery tickets, they drink their beer, and everything is fine. And they will never awaken. That they could rise up and overthrow Big Brother, but the slumbering giant will never awaken.
I remember that part. Yeah. Oh yeah. That is a frightening concept for sure.
And then I watch on television people excited to go back to their football games and go to Las Vegas. And I see that book.
Yeah.
All right, guys, I got to wrap this up.
Well, John, thank you so much, man. It's been really, really a pleasure having you on.
My pleasure. I could sit here for an hour, but I've got parents screaming for me.
Yeah, no problem. That's cool. No problem. Well, just stand line real quick. We're going to close this section out. And, John, just real quick, please plug your book where people can find it.
Yeah, so they can go on Amazon and find Theoretical Weirdo. All of my social media is John E.L. Tenney. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of it. So, or you can just go to Google and you can type John Tenney Weirdo and follow it down any rabbit hole it leads you.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, John. And guys, we'll be back to close out the show on Conspirinormal. All right, guys, welcome back. Just a quick wrap up. That was good interview with John Tenney. I was really happy and satisfied with that. Got a little political there at the end, but just felt that we needed to probably cover some of that stuff. What did you think about all that, Sergio?
Oh, it was a great talk, and it's a great book. Just kind of showing some of his unique insights and all the experience he has in these worlds.
Yeah, Theoretical Weirdo. John is one of those people that I really, really respect. He's been around for a long time, and he really has extensive knowledge in paranormal and Forteana and weird conspiracy stuff, and he knows just about everything you could possibly know about a lot of this stuff. The guy's a walking encyclopedia. So guys, just the usual, but there's one more thing that we want to talk about before we leave. We do have, and if you guys missed it, we did talk on a kind of special small little mini-sode or whatever. We talked about Strange Realities Conference 2020 and what we are doing for that. So guys, we are going to be having it online. It is going to be an online conference. We are working on that at the moment, trying to figure out how we're going to do all of it. But we are putting it together, and we're going to have a lot of people that were from last year's live conference. And that is going to be September 25th, 26th, and 27th. And it's going to be a pretty low price for people to come to check out, hang out with us online, watch some really good speakers. Is there anything that you wanted to add about that?
No, we're just trying to make it a real unique experience and trying to capture some of that same communal feel and some of that same hallway talks, but it affords us a lot of new opportunities to try new things too, for people who wouldn't otherwise be able to come, and for us to be able to get speakers who we may not have been able to get. So
right,
it'll be different. And
we're also going to be doing something in a couple of stages. The first stage is we've got someone editing the presentations of our speakers from last year. And the first thing that we're going to be doing is for our Patreons. We are going to be putting those up probably on a weekly basis for the next few weeks. By the time this has dropped, you probably should at least have one, and that's the presentation by Mark Anthony Wyatt. And that's going to be every week. We're going to do that for our Patreons. And then in August, about a month, we've got something else planned that we're going to do. And Sergio can tell you about that.
Well, we are going to actually stream last year's conference live for free as a build up to the new Strange Realities digital conference. So we've got a lot of really great footage, and we'll piece that together and be streaming that live in August. Yeah,
so you guys are gonna get a teaser of some of the presentations that you're gonna probably what it's like to be at this conference and what we talk about. Many of you that listen to the show probably know that already. So very, very soon, if not by the time this posts, we should have the price figured out, which is going to be low, and we should have tickets available, figure out how we're going to do all that. So but if you are a Patreon, you're going to get to see those first, and you can go to www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal, and there is also our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Conspirinormal, and give us a nice 5-star review. We would really appreciate it. So I think that's it, guys, and we'll be back next time with another great episode of Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal, or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.